Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. So Caitlin Clark and Stephanie White got into it. They absolutely got into it during a very intense stretch of the game. And even more so, this didn't just stay between Caitlin Clark and Stephanie White on the sideline. It actually continued onto the bench at the end of the first quarter. And what's interesting is it wasn't even only with Steph White in that moment, because if you look closely, Caitlin Clark also got into what looked to be a heated argument with Brianne January right there on the sideline. An absolutely intense exchange about that possession and what had just happened on the floor. And the thing is, from everything we've seen so far with Caitlin Clark, it does seem like she is the type of competitor who will stand her ground if she believes she is right. It doesn't matter who it is with, she will continue to argue her point. It doesn't matter who it is with. Anyone who has been around high-level competitors understands this pattern. When they are told they are wrong but strongly believe they are right, they will push back immediately. Even in school settings, you would see very intelligent students arguing with teachers when they were convinced they had the correct answer. They would say, "No, I'm right, you're wrong." It's a common trait among high achievers and elite athletes. It comes from confidence, competitiveness, and a strong belief in their reads of the game. And in most cases, there's still mutual respect between players, coaches, and staff, even after heated moments like this. I don't think this goes further than today. We have to go into it with some context. So the Indiana Fever, as we've seen from all of the preseason footage, run a very specific defensive scheme. When the Indiana Fever are guarding wing pick-and-roll actions, so let's say an offensive player here has the ball and comes off a screen, the defensive coverage they are instructed to execute is an ice coverage, also commonly referred to as downing the screen. So what that means is the on-ball defender is supposed to force the ball handler away from the screen entirely, steering them toward the sideline instead of allowing them to use the pick to turn the corner. At the same time, the defender guarding the screener is supposed to show body and take away any clean path into the middle. They are effectively icing wing screens, and the purpose of that is very simple. Force a difficult angle, take away downhill momentum, and make the ball handler settle for a tougher pull-up jumper or reset the possession. But the trade-off is important. If the ball handler is able to beat that initial ice angle, it immediately turns into a scramble situation. And once that happens, the entire defense shifts into rotation mode. Help, help, help becomes the priority. In those scenarios, Caitlin Clark would typically be involved in the backside rotation, often dropping toward the corner or tagging the low man, depending on the exact coverage rules being called. So the defensive system is built on discipline first, then rotation and recovery second. Now, breaking down a standard wing pick and roll, you usually have proper spacing with offensive players positioned in the corner, on the wing, and in the opposite slot area to stretch the floor. If the on-ball defender gets beaten off the dribble, the next layer of help has to step up immediately. The screener's defender might either sink into the lane to protect the rim or stunt at the ball before recovering back out. From there, the rotation chain continues. One defender tags the roller, another takes away the corner pass, and Caitlin Clark is often responsible for rotating across to cover the weak side corner or the next available passing option, depending on the defensive call. That is the basic structure of how this ice-based wing pick-and-roll coverage and scramble rotation is designed to function within the Indiana Fever system. They're denying and scrambling, or rather, they're icing and scrambling. That's the core of what they do. But with about 40-something seconds left in the quarter, the next sequence came immediately after Caitlin Clark hit a deep 30-footer that had everyone reacting. So, Caitlin Clark is guarding Zia Cooke on the wing during a defensive possession with the score at 32-17. And just before this, Lexi Hull had just been blocked, which shifts momentum slightly, and this possession becomes important to break down in detail. So, Caitlin Clark starts this defensive possession matched up on Zia Cooke on the wing. We see ice coverage again, forcing baseline, with rotations ready behind the play as the defense shifts quickly in real time.
The problem is, this is a guard-to-guard screen. Conventional basketball knowledge says you usually switch a guard-to-guard screen in that situation. In most systems, especially at high-level defensive schemes, that is the default coverage read. Automatic switch unless otherwise called out. However, the Indiana Fever's tactic on wing ball screens is not a pure switch system. They are specifically instructed to ice those actions. That changes everything about the angle, the footwork, and the responsibility chain behind the play. So what does Caitlin Clark do? Caitlin Clark is clearly icing the screen. Caitlin Clark is here executing the ice coverage exactly the way it is designed in the scheme. Ty Harris is in position on the weak side of the action, but realistically, based on how ice coverage works in this system, she should already be functioning like a low helper or a stunt and recover defender, depending on how the ball handler reacts to the force. So, Caitlin ices the screen correctly. That part is executed properly. She forces the ball handler away from the screen, takes away the middle angle, and pushes the action toward the sideline, just like the defensive call requires. The issue is that Ty Harris does not fully engage in the coverage correctly behind the play. Instead of stepping into a proper help position or briefly hedging the gap to deter penetration, she stays attached too long to her assignment and does not fully contain the ball or properly tag the roller's space. That decision opens up a pocket of space at the exact moment the ball handler turns the corner. Aaliyah Boston is also in the rotation area, positioned as part of the interior help structure, but the coverage is already compromised because the initial containment layer did not fully hold the drive long enough for the rotation chain to stabilize. As a result, Zia Cooke gets an open lane to the basket because the ice action does its job, forcing the ball wide, but the weak side and help rotations do not fully arrive on time to seal the driving gap. Help is late from Misha Hines-Allen, and there is also a questionable foul call on Caitlin Clark in the sequence as she is trying to recover into the play and recontest the ball without giving up a direct finish at the rim. That is where the argument stems from, because immediately after the play, you see Caitlin Clark in a heated exchange with Stephanie White on the sideline. The frustration is visible, because the possession ends in points against a coverage that, in theory, was executed correctly at the point of initiation. From a pure basketball standpoint, this is a defensive breakdown rooted in miscommunication rather than a single isolated mistake. Ty Harris is not necessarily wrong in intent, but she makes a read that does not align with the ice coverage being called in real time. She had enough time and visual confirmation to recognize that Caitlin Clark was clearly icing the screen, which should have triggered an automatic adjustment in help positioning and rotation timing. In most conventional basketball systems, especially in guard-to-guard screens, you typically switch the action. That is the default rule. 9 times out of 10, you switch, because it simplifies coverage and reduces communication load. But in this system, Caitlin Clark ices it, so there is clearly a coverage mismatch or communication gap between perimeter defenders and the backside rotation unit. From Caitlin Clark's perspective, if she hears screen left or reads the setup developing, she's going to ice it and expect the backline rotations to immediately follow the scheme principles. Force wide, contain, then rotate on the back end. So this is ultimately a defensive breakdown, not necessarily an individual failure in isolation. It's a chain reaction where one missed rotation timing decision impacts the entire structure. Immediately after, Stephanie White is visibly animated, and the sideline reaction escalates because the possession results in an open layup despite the ice being correctly initiated. There's frustration across the defensive group, and Caitlin Clark appears to be arguing that she executed the coverage exactly as called, and the breakdown occurred behind her in the rotation layers. At the core, this is a miscommunication play, where an ice coverage meets a breakdown in responsibility tagging and rotation discipline, leading to an uncontested or lightly contested finish at the rim for Zia Cooke. And this is important. Defensive miscommunications often look like individual mistakes in real time, especially in live broadcast speed.
But on film, they're usually system-level failures involving multiple decision points across multiple defenders. A similar situation happened previously in a play involving Marina Mabrey, where a rotation misread between Caitlin Clark and Kelsey Mitchell led to an open look. On live action, it appears like one defender lost the assignment, but on film, it's clearly a breakdown in coverage sequencing and communication timing involving Caitlin Clark and Kelsey Mitchell together in the rotation chain. The key point is that good teams and high-level players do get into heated exchanges after possessions like this. That does not automatically mean dysfunction or a locker room conflict. It's part of competitive basketball at high intensity. Players argue, coaches correct, and emotions run extremely high in real time, especially when a possession breaks down from something that was supposed to be structurally sound. But most of the time, once it's reviewed and understood, it resets quickly and becomes a teaching point rather than a lasting issue. Even if you break down the possession multiple times, it's still difficult to assign full blame to one individual because the breakdown happens across multiple rotations, multiple reads, and multiple timing decisions rather than a single error. At the end of the day, it resulted in an open layup due to a defensive miscommunication within an ice coverage framework that did not fully connect on the backside rotation chain. Caitlin Clark is frustrated because, from her perspective, she iced the screen correctly and expected the rotation behind her, Ty Harris, Aaliyah Boston, and the help side structure involving Misha Hines-Allen to match the scheme exactly as designed. And that's essentially the possession. That's the video. So tell me what you think. Don't forget, like and subscribe.